This is episode 70 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Elisa Tersini, Digital Research Fellow at the Folger Shakespeare Library. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Was seen as someone who was a patron and a sponsor of the arts, including theatre. In fact, in 1599, so 4 years before he comes to the throne in England, he had a playhouse erected in Scotland and English players employed.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When James VI of Scotland became James I of England, he did so as the son of Mary Queen of Scots and brought with him a tumultuous history and risk for civil war. And an example of the king's extraordinary gift at diplomacy and unification, he also brought into England his ability to stabilize conflict and unite warring parties around his position as king. At 39 years old, when William Shakespeare was at the height of his career as a playwright in London, the new king would officially patronize Shakespeare's company and include the Bard, the Burbages, and the Lord Chamberlain's men in his campaign to win the heart of England. Here to help us explore the story of what it was like for William Shakespeare when Elizabeth died and King James came to the throne, as well as the religious reformations that defined the cultures of these nations and divided the Scottish Kirk from the Church of England ideologically, is our special guest, Dr. James Loxley. James Loxley is professor of early modern literature at the University of Edinburgh. He is the author of a number of books on early modern poetry and drama, including Royalism and Poetry in the English Civil Wars from 1997, Ben Jonson in 2002, and Shakespeare, Jonson, and the Claims of the Performative from 2013. He has also published on ordinary language philosophy, the work of Thomas Hobbes, and theories of performativity. Together with Anna Groundwater and Julie Sanders, he has edited a previously unknown eyewitness account of Ben Jonson's astonishing walk from London to Edinburgh in 1618. He has also led a project to create a digital map of literary Edinburgh. We are delighted to have him visit with us today and share with us the moment in Shakespeare's life when the Bard found himself finally under the official patronage of the English monarchy. Hello, James. Welcome to the show.
Hi, good to be here.
King James of Shakespeare's lifetime was James VI in Scotland and James I in England. For the rebel colonials who do not have a personal relationship with the monarchy, please explain why one monarch has separate names.
Well, you see, that's a peculiarity of the 17th century, really, that James himself started. It's because he was the king of three kingdoms, in fact. He was the king of Scotland, first of all. And then in 1603, when he was himself 37, he became king of England and Ireland as well. So he was the sixth king called James in Scotland, but the first king called James in England. So hence he has two numbers.
Was his ascension normal and anticipated in England for 1603? I mean, normally the crown would pass to the son of the monarch, but since Elizabeth did not have children, why was James selected to be the next king?
Well, Elizabeth, of course, as you said, didn't have any heirs, so there wasn't an obvious next person in line for the English throne. The Tudor dynasty was coming to an end. So obviously there was an issue around who might take over. And that issue essentially dominated the last few years of Elizabeth's reign, though it was there right from the beginning because there were persistent issues or concerns about whether she would get married and who she might marry and who would be a suitable husband and how to get an heir, essentially, so that the future of the monarchy could be secured. Now, when it became apparent that she wasn't going to have an heir herself, some kind of pressure was put on her to essentially name an heir, to settle the succession, which she steadfastly refused to do. She wasn't willing to go along with that. So, of course, a number of different contenders started to suggest themselves. And the person who had what seemed to be, to many, the strongest claim to the throne was the person she called our cousin of Scotland, King James, who was himself descended from the English King Henry VII on both his mother's and his father's side. His parents were in fact cousins. They were grandchildren of Margaret Tudor, who was Henry VII's daughter, therefore Henry VIII's sister, and she had been married to King James IV of Scotland in 1503. So he had a title to the throne on both sides, but he also had some very crucial other considerations which made him the most suitable candidate. The first thing, the most important thing, was that he was a Protestant. Protestant monarchs, Protestant potential monarchs were thin on the ground, really, in the Europe at the time. So someone who was a Protestant king was obviously going to be a much better bet than someone who might be a Catholic. So the fact that he was a Protestant made him very eligible. Another crucial thing was that he was an adult king with the relevant skills and experience. He already had the CV, if you want. He already had the resume. James himself was a cradle king, is how he described himself. He'd been born in 1566, but he began to rule in his own right at the age of 16 or 17. He'd been a sort of infant king, a child king before that, looked after by others. He was formidably bright, very well educated, a shrewd strategist, a student of the arts of government, and he'd managed, during his adult reign in Scotland, to tame Scotland's two most powerful groups, its nobles and its churchmen. He was a proven king, a known quantity. Crucially also, given that this was a succession issue, he was married to a fertile queen, and he had ready-made heirs. So he basically had all the personal attributes that they were looking for, really, in a king. But there's another dimension to this, which is not just that he was, as it were, applying for the job himself. He himself spent many years and an awful lot of diplomatic effort winning over supporters in England, manoeuvring himself into the right position. And although Elizabeth had resisted naming an heir, as I said, when she supposedly named James on her deathbed, it was in reality already a fait accompli.
After this massive fight and potential for outright civil war when Elizabeth became queen in the first place, why did she choose the son of Mary, Queen of Scots? Why was there no war when James became king, given that both nations at this point had cause for revolt? I mean, is this not just a massive example of James's diplomacy?
Well, it is evidence, I think, of the fact that he'd managed to get his crucial allies in England, particularly Elizabeth's chief statesman, on side. He'd managed to get them on his team, so that although she was fading, and although, on her death, the ministers around her were able to ensure that a smooth succession took place, and that had already been prepared for, essentially. There wasn't the sense somehow that nobody knew what was going to happen, that everything was up in the air, that other people might be able to leap in and make a claim. So nobody did. So James was able to succeed smoothly, which is really what people wanted. Succession moments were very, very fraught. And they could be really difficult, particularly if you were coming as, if there wasn't an obvious candidate. So James had done a lot of work to put himself in that position and make sure that when it came to it, he was the one in pole position, the one around whom everybody sort of coalesced as the obvious candidate. So that was quite canny on his part.
Once James was King of England and Scotland and Ireland, was this the first time those nations had been united this way?
Absolutely, yeah. The history of England and Scotland, Anglo-Scottish relations prior to 1603, is a history of often open hostility, plenty of wariness and caution. The Scots had a long-established alliance with the French, who were often, of course, England's dynastic and international enemies. There was a lot of hostility. There'd been a lot of violence, even into the mid-16th century. There were English attempts to sort of enforce their political will on Scotland. So there was a history of outright hostility, not just neighbourliness and difference. They had never been united before. And really, they weren't actually united then either. James himself did want to produce a union, to generate a union essentially between the two things. He wanted to be called the King of Great Britain, that there would now be this new thing called Great Britain. And as it were, England and Scotland would disappear into history as old names for superseded kingdoms. But neither the English Parliament nor the Scottish Parliament and governing classes were particularly happy with his proposals. So those were pushed into the long grass and never got very far. So what you actually had was a very limited union union, which was really only the union of the two monarchies in the same person. James VI and First to start with, and then his heirs and successors, up until 1707, when you have the political constitutional union of England and Scotland to create the United Kingdom of Great Britain.
Now, you alluded to this earlier when you said one of James's credentials was that he was Protestant.
Yeah.
Now, Mary Queen of Scots was Catholic, but by the time James VI ascends to the throne in Scotland, as you mentioned, the nation is Protestant. Did Scotland go through a Reformation period after Mary Queen of Scots died?
It did go through a Reformation period, though not after she died. This is where it's a little bit complicated in some ways. The Scottish Reformation actually took place to some extent while Mary was not in a position to govern the kingdom personally, but certainly very much during her reign. In fact, it grew during the 1550s as a sort of popular grassroots movement to some extent. It was strongly associated with a particular fierce reforming preacher, a man called John Knox, and it generated things such as a banding together of Protestant nobles in the late 1550s, a genuine revolt against institutions of the Catholic Church in towns and cities, the displacement of Catholic clergy, seizures of estates and churches, and crucially, the government of the time had no real capacity to put them down, because it had some French troops that it tried to use or wanted to use to reimpose the existing religious order, the Catholic religious order. But the English fleet under, of course, English government, turned up off the coast of Scotland in 1560 and effectively inhibited the Scottish government's ability to use French troops, which it had at its disposal, to exert control. So this kind of happened actually during the regency of Mary of Guise, who is Queen Mary's Catholic mother. Mary herself wasn't even in Scotland. She was in France because she was married to the King of France. But then he died, and she returned to rule in her own right in 1560. But by the time that she did so, the Scottish Kirk, what we call the church, had already been reformed in doctrine, in organisation, and in worship. So you had a Protestant Kirk and a Catholic monarch, which is obviously an uneasy arrangement, to say the least.
Was this Reformation similar to the English Reformation? How divided were the two nations religiously when James comes to the throne in 1603?
Well, the crucial thing, one of the things that made them very similar, was that they were both Protestant, which was very important in the European context of the time. And that's something that people who were pursuing the idea of legal or constitutional union between the two kingdoms put at the top of their list of causes, as it were, good reasons for promoting union. But their reformations had occurred in very different ways. And as I've just said, the Scottish Reformation was done in the face of government and royal opposition, whereas the English Reformation, through Henry VIII and later through Edward VI and then Queen Elizabeth herself, had been government-led, essentially. So this difference in dynamics behind these two reformations had led to very different kinds of churches. The English church, the Church of England, had the monarch as its head, and it was governed by bishops who basically were under the monarch's control. And so the whole thing was a kind of top-down institution. The Scottish Kirk, by contrast, and I'm putting it relatively crudely, but I'm trying to emphasize the differences here. The Scottish Kirk, by contrast, was a kind of ground-up institution. It had, as I say, been created in the face of royal resistance, and therefore it was very much about the power and authority of individual parishes, of the ways in which those parishes could be organized to produce a national church, and therefore it had a very different sense of how the church ought to be organized. It was a Presbyterian church, to put it in its simplest terms. So those reformations were pretty different affairs. Doctrinally, they weren't radically different. They were both Calvinist in their essentials, but in terms of how they saw themselves within the society of their time, they were significantly different. As I say, the church in England would see itself as aligned with government policies subordinate to the monarch, whereas the church in Scotland did not see itself like that. It saw itself as another source of authority, essentially, within the kingdom. So much so that one of the leading Presbyterian clergymen at the time was quite happy to say to King James that he didn't have any authority in the church, that he was nothing more than Christ's silly vassal. He was essentially no more of an authority when it came to the church than any other member of that institution. So very different to that extent, even if, as both Protestant institutions, they were pretty similar.
Did that particular bishop continue living after he did such a thing?
Well, he wasn't a bishop, but he did. Yeah, he was not always in royal favour. He did some time in prison, as you might imagine.
Yes,
for someone who was challenging the fundamental beliefs that James himself had about his authority.
Yes, that's very bold. Who was that?
It's a guy called Andrew Melville. He's a really interesting writer and preacher at the time, and a poet, but also a very uncompromising Presbyterian.
Obviously.
In his religious practice.
Was there apprehension on Shakespeare's part or that of England as a whole about this new king being opposed to players and theatres, giving his Puritan associations?
Well, this is it, yeah, because of course the Kirk in Scotland did have a reputation for being more, hotter in its Protestantism, precisely because some of those reasons I've outlined. Though James himself was at odds with his church, as I said earlier. He tried, one of his main achievements in Scotland was to actually kind of get on top of the church as an institution and managed to exert authority over it, which he was able to do through using various different church institutions. And he actually began to introduce bishops into the church in Scotland against, all the wishes and desires of the Presbyterian nobles and the leading churchmen of the time in Scotland. So he was kind of opposed, although he was doctrinally absolutely fine as far as they were concerned, he was kind of opposed to the way in which they organized the church or how they saw the church sitting in society. He wanted it much more like the English model, where the secular ruler was also in charge of the church. He didn't want alternative sources of power and authority, essentially, roaming around inside his kingdoms. So there was a sense that he wasn't necessarily completely in tune with that Presbyterian Kirk and its own ideas and its own way of running things. And it also meant that he didn't necessarily share the more Puritan leanings of the Kirk in Scotland, or indeed of their sort of religious allies on the more radical wing of the church in England. He was, in fact, well known as a poet himself. He'd published poetry. He was very well known as a writer. As I said already, he was very learned and very bright. He was seen as someone who was a patron and a sponsor of the arts, including theatre. In fact, in 1599, so 4 years before he comes to the throne in England, he had a playhouse erected in Scotland and English players employed. So there wasn't a professional theatre in Scotland as there was in England, but there was a theatre under the protection of the king during that time. So he wasn't, I think, seen as any kind of a threat to that, because it was recognised that he didn't share the sort of cultural tendencies of the more radical Presbyterians or more radical Puritans in England. So on those grounds, he was absolutely fine as far as they were concerned.
Now, Shakespeare's company was not the only prominent or popular playing company in England when James comes to the throne, but he did choose the Lord Chamberlain's men to become the king's men, and pretty quickly, because Shakespeare and his company marched in James's coronation parade as officially patronized. Why did he choose Shakespeare's company?
Well, it's never been entirely clear what was going on there or exactly why that happened. I think we're starting to get a stronger sense of exactly how that might have come about, or exactly what kind of forces and personalities might have been present in that. And I've already mentioned that James actually employed English players in companies of English actors when they were in Scotland. He was plugged in there to that industry already. He already had a knowledge and an understanding to some extent of the playing scene in England. And there's one key figure. He's a man called Lawrence Fletcher. And Lawrence Fletcher is found in the records, in the accounts of James's government in Scotland. He's noted as someone who's being given money by the king. He's also noted as someone who is on tour in Scotland in 1601. He's noted as one of the king's servants, which suggests he's actually a member of the household or in an analogous position in Scotland as the king's men were to become in England after James took them up. So he was clearly a kind of key figure in the performance of drama, the staging of drama in James's reign in Scotland. And now this guy, Fletcher, then turns up in 1603 in England. And he is the guy who is new to the Lord Chamberlain's men, their numbers have dwindled a little. They need a boost. And one of the guys they recruit is this guy, Fletcher, who's been one of the king's servants in Scotland. and is then appears on the documentation affirming the establishment of the Lord Chamberlain's men as the King's men. So it suggests to me that Burbage and Shakespeare and others who were reasonably canny in what they were doing knew full well that the merits of an alliance with Fletcher, and that Fletcher came on board as one of the King's men, as one of the sharers, and that he was then able to ensure that they got the peachy gig of being the King's servants in England, as he himself had been one of the King's servants in Scotland. So I think he's not been seen as a very important figure, but people, scholars such as Holger Syme at the moment, are beginning to suggest that he might have been a rather more important figure than we've hitherto thought.
The power of networking coming through even in the
In a court society like that, it's all run on anything that's run on patronage is run on networks, essentially, isn't it? So knowing the right guy, the guy who can have a word with the right people and can put in place a model that's worked elsewhere is a shrewd move on the part of Shakespeare and co.
Very smart. Is there a noticeable change overall in the style or content of Shakespeare's plays after James patronizes the company?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to see. There's certainly sort of a take-up of different topics, clearly. So there's a take-up of different kind of ideas and things. The sort of patriotic English histories, by and large, are abandoned insofar as they were still a kind of feature of Shakespeare's interest. We have him instead tackling Scottish history, of course, in Macbeth, which is a tricky play, really. It's a bit of a daring move, actually, doing Macbeth in the early years of James's reign. There were a number of false steps by English writers and English playwrights in handling the matter of Scotland and Scotland's history, and indeed the Scottish presence, the new Scottish presence in London life at the time. And three of Shakespeare's contemporaries, Ben Jonson, George Chapman, and John Marston, got themselves in trouble in 1605 because they were reported essentially for having put some anti-Scottish jokes in the play they'd written, Eastward Ho. And they were ended up imprisoned and in fear of some kind of corporal punishment.
Well, it was a very tense time right then because the gunpowder plot had just
Of course.
happened. And I always wondered if Macbeth was Shakespeare's attempt to prove his loyalty to James because of all this tension that was going on. He wanted to say, you can trust me. You made a good choice, Patrick.
I think it's often been seen, it has sometimes been seen as a royal play, essentially, as a play written very much tailored to the kind of propaganda needs of the new king at that particular time. As you say, a moment of alarm and uncertainty after the near success of the gunpowder plot. It may be that. I think though that we have no proof that it was ever performed before James or anything like that, but that's often been suggested. But I think the difference with Macbeth is it's the way it handles Scottish historical matters. It does it very adroitly. And it does it adroitly in a way that manages to accord with Scottish sensitivities and yet also with the kind of Anglo-centric approach of its primary audience.
Which is really kind of classic Shakespeare, because that's essentially what he does with England's history, serving those up to Elizabeth I. So it could also just be Shakespeare being Shakespeare, and now we have a Scottish king. We're going to give him a play about Scottish history. Yes,
but he also needs to make sure he gets it right. He also needs to make sure that he says the right things, that he invokes the right mythic histories, that he doesn't invoke historical events or historical precedents that might well give offence. For example, make references to the numerous English kings who tried to invade Scotland and tried to conquer it. So he gets it right. And I think that's something that's distinctive. There aren't many people who try to write Scottish plays after James comes to the throne, partly because of the kinds of potential sensitivities of doing that properly. Shakespeare is able to do it, perhaps because he's got connections with people like Fletcher who know what buttons to push. They've got a deep knowledge of the Scottish king, his Scottish court, how it works, all of its preferences and its cultural patterns, and they're able to slot into those. But as you say, Shakespeare's good at doing that.
We can safely say he wasn't a man to back away from a challenge, for sure.
No, that's true.
Now, yes. I know we would love to explore this topic more, as obviously there is a wealth of history and information to look into here. Do you have any favorite books or resources that you would recommend we use to learn more about this?
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the books I really like for this is a really vivid account of, as it were, the difference that James makes in Shakespeare's London and therefore Shakespeare's dramatic life. James Shapiro's book, 1606, William Shakespeare in the Year of Lear, is a really readable account of the kind of the Jacobean moment, I think, and how Shakespeare became Jacobean. So I'd certainly recommend that. There's a couple of really nice little biographies of James. He's a figure who hasn't always had the best historical reputation. There's a lot of sort of anecdotes about him as a dubious individual, but there's a couple of little biographies which give a full account of what he did as a king. And so there's Thomas Cogswell's book, James I, The Phoenix King, which is a great little read. And there's also a slightly more substantial biography by Pauline Croft, just called James I. So those are both well worth a look.
Thank you for those references. We will definitely link to all of those in the show notes for today's episode. Now, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I am supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Okay, yeah. Well, first of all, of course, I'd have to insist that the Bible was the King James Version.
Absolutely, I think so. Yeah.
Which is, of course, one of the great cultural monuments of James's reign.
Yes, 1611 edition just for you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. The other one I would insist on is actually, I'm a big fan of Ben Jonson, Shakespeare's friend and perhaps to some extent rival. So I would be taking Ben Jonson's works with me as well. And with Jonson and Shakespeare, I'd roughly have what I needed of the two different sides of the world to take with me. So that would do the trick.
A good choice for sure. You'd be set on your deserted island. Absolutely. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm doing a few things. One of the things I'm doing at the moment is I'm working on an edition of a play written at the same time as Hamlet, but by the playwright Thomas Dekker, The Shoemaker's Holiday, which is a fascinating, crazy play, and I'm really enjoying doing the work I'm doing to produce an edition of that. I'm also involved in projects to make a number of digital literary maps, which is one of the things I like to do. I'm working on the initial stages of a project examining Anglo-Scottish cultural relations in the reign of James VI and I. So either side of 1603, really, which is going under the provisional title, Both Sides the Tweed, which is a rather great folk song. So that's me.
Well, those are great. We will look forward to keeping up with your latest projects and appreciate you so much stopping by today to share with us the Shakespeare history of James I. This has been delightful.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
Each week, I pack extra history into the show notes of our episode. Not only will there be downloadable transcripts available, as you might expect from a podcast, but there is extra bonus history there as well. I'll share with you who Andrew Marvell was and how you can learn more about him, along with details about the Scottish Kirk, the Church of England, and Lawrence Fletcher, who flies under the radar of Shakespeare history in general, but was so influential in assuring the success of the Lord Chamberlain's men as they became the King's men in 1603. Find all of this history and links where you can learn more, including the resources mentioned today by James Loxley, all at the show notes at castycash.com/episode 70. That's castycash.com/EP70. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. I'm Casty Cash, that's Shakespeare Girl, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.